What if I told you that one of the greatest cities in human history, a city once thought impossible to conquer, fell not to a massive army, but to a few colossal cannons built by a single man? And what if I told you that this single fall marked the moment the medieval world died and the modern age began? Is the story of Constantinople. The year is 1453. For more than 1,000 years, its walls had stood unbroken, the proud guardians of the Byzantine Empire, the last light of Rome itself. Behind those walls, the sound of church bells and whispered prayers echo through marble streets, while outside, the thunder of Ottoman drums shakes the very earth. The world watches as two civilizations, Christian and Muslim, ancient and rising, collide in one final, breathtaking siege. But this wasn't just a battle for land. It was a struggle for the soul of history itself. And at the center of it all stood a weapon so powerful it could tear through centuries of stone. The great cannons that would end an empire and an era. Welcome to the entire history of the Fall of Constantinople, 1453. The cannons that ended an era. The eternal city on the edge of time. The sun rose over Constantinople like a crown of gold. Its light shimmered on the domes of Hagia Sophia, glinted off the sea walls, and cast long shadows over the mighty Theodosian Walls, 3 layers of stone and mortar that had defied every invader for 1,000 years. From Attila the Hun to the Persians, from the Arabs to the Bulgars, all had broken against these walls like waves against rock dot to the people within. The city was not just a capital, it was a miracle. It was the last living heir of the Roman Empire, a world apart from the crumbling kingdoms of the West. Its streets were filled with traders from Venice and Genoa, priests in glittering robes, scholars poring over ancient manuscripts, and soldiers whose armor still bore the eagle of Rome. Yet beneath the beauty there was decay. The empire was a shadow of what it had been. Once stretching from Spain to Syria, now its territory had shrunk to a few scattered lands and this one city. The emperor, Constantine XI Palaeologos, ruled not an empire, but a memory. And beyond the horizon, another empire was rising. The Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II was only 21 years old, yet he carried the ambition of 1,000 conquerors. To him, Constantinople wasn't just a city, it was destiny. There is only one empire, one world, one faith, he declared, and there must be one emperor. For Mehmed, taking Constantinople meant more than glory. It meant fulfilling prophecy. Both Christian and Muslim texts whispered of a great conqueror who would claim the city that straddled the continents. To the Christians, it was the city of Constantine the Great, the new Rome. To the Muslims, it was the jewel promised to those who followed the prophet's command. Surely, Constantinople will be conquered. What a wonderful leader will that leader be, and what a wonderful army will that army be. Mehmed believed he was that leader, but first, he needed something no one before him had a weapon strong enough to destroy the unbreakable walls. And that's where the story takes its first unexpected turn. Far from the city, in a dusty workshop, a man named Orban, a Hungarian engineer, worked feverishly over a design that would change the world. He was a master cannon maker, a genius with iron and fire. He had once offered his skills to the Byzantines, but the impoverished emperor could not pay his price, so rejected and bitter. Orban took his invention to the young sultan instead. Mehmed listened. What Orban promised was extraordinary. A cannon so large, it could fire a stone ball weighing over half a ton, a weapon that could shatter even Constantinople's ancient defenses. Mehmed's eyes gleamed. "Build it," he said simply, and so began the birth of a monster. In the city of Edirne, the Ottoman capital, Orban's foundries burned day and night. Hundreds of men worked to cast the cannon, a bronze giant 27 feet long, its barrel wide enough for a man to crawl through. When it was finished, it was so heavy it took 60 oxen and hundreds of soldiers to drag it across the land toward Constantinople. Within the city walls, Emperor Constantine prepared for what felt like the end of the world. He knew the odds. The Byzantine army numbered barely 7,000 men, including mercenaries from Genoa and Venice. Mehmed's forces, on the other hand, were over 80,000 strong. Yet Constantine refused to flee. "God will not abandon us," he told his council. "If we fall, let it be with honor." As the Ottomans approached, the people of the city gathered in Hagia Sophia, praying beneath its vast dome. Candles flickered like stars as their voices rose, a trembling chorus against the thunder that was coming. One morning in April 1453, the earth began to shake. From across the plain came the sound that would echo through history, the first roar of the great cannon. A ball of stone the size of a man tore through the air and struck the wall with a sound like thunder. The ground trembled, dust filled the sky, and the city that had stood for a millennium felt its first wound. Priests rushed through the streets with relics held high, crying for divine mercy. But outside the gates, Mehmed smiled. He had found the key to Rome's last fortress. Yet even he didn't know, not yet, that the cannons that could break walls would also break the world that had built them. The siege had begun, and with it, the end of an era. The siege begins. Fire, faith, and iron the night before the cannons fired again. Constantinople slept uneasily under a blood-red moon. The air was thick with dust and dread, the kind that clings to your throat and makes silence unbearable. No one dared to speak of it aloud, but everyone knew the city that had outlived empires was now trembling on the edge of its own legend. At dawn, the world roared. The Ottoman cannons thundered across the plains like dragons waking from a 1,000-year sleep. Stones the size of oxen flew through the air, smashing into the walls that had defied the world's greatest armies. Each blast was like a heartbeat of doom. Dust filled the air. Church bells clanged, and yet the defenders, exhausted, hungry, and furious to fill every breach with rubble, timber, anything they could find. Inside the city, Emperor Constantine XI stood upon the battlements, his armor dulled by soot, his eyes burning with a faith too deep to break. He looked out at the horizon where Mehmed II's armada, 1,000 strong, shimmered like a sea of steel. Banners of red and gold rippled in the wind. Minarets from the Ottoman camp gleamed beneath the sun. Across the strait, the young sultan stood watching two men, one born to end an empire. The other fated to die, with it stared across the smoke at each other, knowing that history itself was watching them. But Constantinople still had hope. The chain across the Golden Horn held strong, blocking Mehmed's fleet from entering the harbor. Behind it, the Byzantine navy, small but fierce, guarded the city's last lifeline. As long as the sea remained theirs, food and faith might still trickle in. Mehmed, however, was no ordinary conqueror. To him, every obstacle was a riddle waiting to be solved. He ordered his engineers to dig deep tunnels beneath the city walls. Day and night, his men clawed at the earth, dragging barrels of gunpowder into the blackness. The Byzantines responded in kind, sending their own minor veterans from Serbia and Hungary to counterdig. Beneath the soil of Constantinople, a hidden war raged in darkness. Down there, men fought hand-to-hand by torchlight, blades flashing, fire licking at the damp walls. The air stank of sweat, gunpowder, and fear. Above ground, the cannon fire continued without mercy. But fate has a dark sense of humor. One morning, as Orban's great cannon prepared to fire again, something went wrong. The charge misfired. A burst of fire erupted from the breach, and in an instant, the genius who had built the monstrous weapon was torn apart by his own creation. Orban was dead, his dream reduced to smoke and shattered bronze. The Byzantines took it as a sign from heaven. For the first time, laughter echoed across the walls. But Mehmed only stared at the ruins of his cannon and said coldly, "Then the other guns will speak louder." He ordered every piece of artillery to double its fire. Day and night, the plains shook as if the earth itself were in revolt. Still, the city held. For weeks, the defenders fought with a courage that bordered on madness. Italian mercenaries under Giovanni Giustiniani reinforced the weak points, while priests carried relics of saints through the streets, blessing the walls and soldiers alike. Every man, woman, and child knew they were living inside the final chapter of their world. Then came the moment that changed everything in the dead of night. Constantinople awoke to a sound that no one could explain: creaking wood, grinding metal, muffled voices. When the dawn broke, the people rushed to the walls overlooking the harbor. And what they saw left them speechless. The Ottoman fleet, more than 100 ships, was inside the Golden Horn. It was impossible. The great chain still lay stretched across the entrance, unbroken. And yet the red banners of the Sultan fluttered behind it. Mehmed had done the unthinkable. His men had hauled their ships over land, dragging them across greased logs, over hills and valleys, and lowering them into the harbor from the other side. It was a miracle of engineering, a move so audacious that even his enemies couldn't help but admire it. Inside the city, panic erupted. The sea, once their last refuge, was now a prison. The walls, already battered, now faced attack from both land and water. Constantine gathered his council in Hagia Sophia. Some pleaded to negotiate. Others urged surrender. The emperor listened silently, then rose to his feet. "If we are to die," he said, "let it be as Romans. Let the world remember that we did not yield." His words carried through the halls like fire. For a brief, fierce moment, hope returned. Men rushed back to the walls, women carried water to the front lines, and priests raised their crosses high. But outside, Mehmed was already preparing the final blow. The young sultan rode through his camp that night, torches lighting his path. "Tomorrow," he declared, "we storm the city. The walls of Rome will fall, and the world will be reborn." His soldiers cheered until their voices echoed against the sea. The drums began to beat against low at first, then faster, faster, like the pulse of a storm about to break. Inside Constantinople, candles flickered in the windows as people prayed. In Hagia Sophia, thousands gathered beneath the vast dome, the air thick with incense and tears. No one spoke of victory anymore, only endurance, only faith. And as the night deepened, from beyond the walls came a low, rolling sound cannon wheels moving into position, hundreds of torches flaring to life, and the distant chant of an army ready to devour the last light of Byzantium. When dawn came, the sky was red again, not with sunrise, but with fire, and the final battle was about to begin. The final assault, the night Rome died it, began with silence the kind that feels alive, as if the world itself were holding its breath. The smoke of 1,000 fires still hung over the plains of Thrace, glowing faintly in the night. In the heart of Constantinople, Emperor Constantine XI stood before the altar of Hagia Sophia, his armor catching the candlelight like molten gold. Around him, men, women, and children knelt in prayer, their voices trembling but resolute. No one begged for victory anymore. They begged for dignity, for courage, for the strength to meet dawn without fear. Outside, beneath a moon shrouded in ash, an empire waited to die. Across the plain, the Ottoman camp pulsed with life. Torches burned in endless rows, tents fluttered in the night wind, and the distant clang of weapons carried through the air. Mehmed II, only 21 but old in ambition, rode among his soldiers. His eyes, dark and calm, reflected the flames. He spoke few words. None were needed. The men already knew what would happen when the sun rose. He had promised them Constantinople, and by morning, behind him, the great cannons waited, their mouths black and hungry, ready to speak for the last time. As the first light of dawn brushed the sky, a single cannon thundered. The sound rolled across the valley, shaking the very air. Then another. Then all of them. The plain erupted into fire. Stone balls screamed through the smoke and slammed into the walls that had guarded Christendom for 1,000 years. The ground trembled. Towers split open. Dust and flame rained down like judgment. The assault had begun. From the battlements, the defenders fought like lions, cornered. Arrows hissed, bolts flew, and Greek fire spilled from the parapets in burning streams. Emperor Constantine rode through the chaos, his white horse streaked with soot, shouting for his men to hold the line. The Genoese commander, Giovanni Giustiniani, stood beside him, rallying his soldiers with fearless precision. Every breach they patched, every fallen stone they replaced. They fought not for victory anymore, but for memory for the empire that had been their world. But Mehmed's army came in waves. Each time the Byzantines threw them back, another larger wave followed. The Sultan's voice rose above the din, calling his janissaries forward, the elite corps, silent and disciplined, their faces expressionless beneath iron helmets. They advanced over the bodies of their comrades, scaling ladders into smoke and flame. For a while, the defenders held them. Then the walls began to give way. In the chaos, a terrible accident sealed the city's fate. Near the Kirkeporta Gaitan, old, half-forgotten postern in the northern sector, a small door stood unbarred, left open in confusion. Ottoman scouts discovered it and slipped through like shadows. At first, only a handful entered, then hundreds. Soon the green banners of the Sultan rose above the inner walls. A shout went up. They are inside. Panic swept through the city like wildfire. Soldiers abandoned their posts to rush toward the breach, leaving other walls exposed. It was the one mistake Constantinople could not afford. Giustiniani was struck by shrapnel from a cannon burst. Wounded and bleeding, he was carried from the wall toward the harbor. When his men saw him leave, their courage faltered. The line collapsed. The Ottomans surged forward, pouring through the gaps. Constantine saw it happen, saw his city unravel before his eyes and knew that history had just shifted. The empire founded by Constantine the Great was dying in his hands, yet he did not flee. He dismounted, removed the purple cloak of emperors, and spoke quietly to those still around him. "God has not willed that I live as an emperor," he said, "but he grants me the honor to die as one." Drawing his sword, he plunged into the melee. Witnesses would later swear they saw him fighting beside his soldiers, his armor glinting amid the smoke until he disappeared beneath the tide. The last emperor of Rome vanished, not as a ruler, but as a warrior. By mid-morning, the city was lost. The walls were broken, the gates torn open. Ottoman banners rose above the towers like red flames. Soldiers flooded the streets, and the air filled with the clash of steel, the cries of the dying, the tolling of distant bells. In Hagia Sophia, thousands huddled together, clutching icons and crosses. The great bronze doors shook under the blows of axes. When they finally burst open, sunlight streamed through the smoke as the conquerors entered the ancient cathedral. The world's last Roman sanctuary had fallen. And yet, amid the chaos, Mehmed rode through the city in silence. The roar of victory surrounded him, but his face was grave. He dismounted before the altar of Hagia Sophia, gazed up at the vast dome, still echoing with centuries of prayer, and whispered, "There is no God but God." Then he ordered his soldiers to spare the building. For a brief moment, even he seemed to understand the weight of what had ended. Outside, the streets burned. The empire of Byzantium, the bridge between East and West, the guardian of ancient Rome, was gone. And as the smoke rose into the morning sky, it carried with it the last breath of an age. Yet, in that very moment, something new was being born. The world that began with swords and walls would now be ruled by powder and cannon. The fall of Constantinople was not just the death of a city, it was the birth of a new era, one that would change war, faith, and power forever. But even as Mehmed stood in triumph, a shadow lingered on the horizon, secret yet unfinished. A decision that would shape the fate of empires to come, because the world that ended that morning had only just begun to awaken. The rise of an empire, Mehmed's dream, and the world reborn when the sun rose over. Constantinople, on May 29, 1453, it rose over two worlds, one dying, one being born. The smoke still curled from the shattered towers, drifting across the Golden Horn like a funeral shroud. The city's once white marble glistened black with soot and blood. For days, the screams had filled the air, but now there was only an eerie stillness. The siege was over. The walls that had stood for 1,000 years were silent. And at the heart of that silence rode a young conqueror whose name would echo through eternity, now called Fethi the Conqueror. He entered the city slowly, his horse's hooves echoing against broken stone. Around him, his soldiers bowed in triumph. But Mehmed's eyes were fixed ahead, not on the spoils, not on the corpses, but on the domes that still reached toward the heavens. Hagia Sophia rose before him, immense and wounded, yet still magnificent. For 9 centuries, it had been the beating heart of Christendom. Now, its doors hung open, the last worshippers gone or taken. Mehmed dismounted. He stepped inside the vast cathedral, his boots crunching over marble dust and shattered icons. The air smelled of smoke and incense. Sunlight pierced through the high dome, illuminating the mosaics of Christ and the Virgin, their golden faces dimmed but not erased. For a long moment, the young sultan said nothing. Then he bent down, scooped a handful of dust, and let it fall through his fingers. "The spider weaves the curtains in the palace of the Caesars," he murmured softly, quoting a Persian poet. "The owl calls the watch in the towers of Afrasiab." He knelt upon the ground, pressed his forehead to the marble, and uttered the words that marked the turning of an age. "There is no God but God. Muhammad is the messenger of God." In that moment, Hagia Sophia became Hagia Sophia Kamia Mosque. Outside, The great crescent banners rose over the city that had once called itself eternal. For centuries, empires had dreamed of taking this city. Arabs, Persians, Crusaders all had failed. Mehmed had succeeded where all others had fallen. And yet, as he stood beneath the vast dome, the triumph did not bring him laughter, it brought him vision. Constantinople was not to be destroyed, it was to be reborn. Within days, the young sultan ordered that the looting cease. "This city is now mine," he declared, "and whoever harms it, harms me." He called back the fleeing Greeks, promised them protection, and invited them to rebuild their homes. He welcomed Jews and Christians alike to return, granting them freedom to worship and to live under Ottoman law. In a single gesture, he turned conquest into creation. He renamed the city Istanbul, softened echo of its ancient Greek name. Meaning to the city, he ordered the rebuilding of markets, baths, schools, and mosques. Architects and scholars poured in from every corner of his empire. From the ashes of Byzantium, he began to forge a new world one that blended the East and West in a way the world had never seen. And yet, beneath the calm of this new beginning, there was an unease that even Mehmed could not silence. The fall of Constantinople had not merely ended an empire, it had broken the heart of Christendom. Across Europe, church bells tolled in mourning. Kings and popes trembled, their sleep haunted by the thought of the young sultan who had shattered the gates of the ancient world in Venice. The Doge called an emergency council. In Rome, Pope Nicholas V wept openly, declaring that the light of the world has been extinguished. Every monarch from Hungary to Spain sent messengers and priests to discuss a crusade that never came. Fear and fascination spread in equal measure. Europe had lost its shield and now faced an empire unlike any it had ever known. But Mehmed did not stop at Constantinople. The city was his crown, not his cage. In the years that followed, he marched into Greece, Serbia, and the Balkans. His armies crossed rivers, mountains, and empires, carrying his banner farther than any Ottoman before him. Scholars began to whisper that Mehmed was not merely a conqueror, he was the heir of Alexander, Caesar, and Cyrus, combined, yet behind his ambition lay something deeper. He was obsessed with legacy, with eternity. Every stone he laid in his new capital was meant to outlast him. The Topkapi Palace rose on the Acropolis, where Byzantine emperors once feasted. The Grand Bazaar expanded until it became the beating heart of commerce between continents. Minarets pierced the skyline where once church bells had rung, and still, the young sultan dreamed bigger. He gathered mathematicians, engineers, poets, and philosophers from Persia, Egypt, and even Italy. He read Greek texts in translation, debated theology with monks, and studied siegecraft with the same intensity he studied Aristotle. In him, the sword and the pen walked side by side. Constantinople had fallen by his might, but it would live forever by his mind. For the people who survived the fall, life began to take new shape. Markets reopened, streets filled with the sounds of trade. The city that had been dying became once again the center of the world only, now under a new banner and a new faith. The great fusion of cultures began, and from it would rise a civilization that touched 3 continents. And yet, deep within the rebuilt city, a story still whispered through the night, a story that Mehmed could never quite silence. They said that on the morning the city fell, as Hagia Sophia was breached, the priests inside had carried the Eucharist into the wall itself, and that one day, when Constantinople fell again, they would emerge, unaged. To finish the Mass they began that day, the legend haunted Mehmed. He often rode alone through the city at night, pausing by the ruins of the old Blascherny Palace or the shattered gates of the Theodosian Wall, staring into the darkness as though listening to voices only he could hear. The conqueror who had taken the unbreakable city sometimes felt as if he were living among ghosts, because even though he ruled Constantinople, he knew he had awakened something older than empire, something that could not be conquered by cannon or sword. The idea of Rome. As he stood one evening on the walls he had broken, watching the sun sink into the Bosporus, Mehmed whispered to his vizier, "This city will outlive us all." He was right, but far beyond his empire's borders, a storm was already brewing. Across the seas, in small kingdoms of Europe and ports of the rising West, new powers were stirring, powers that would soon turn from holy wars to horizons of discovery, powers born in the shadow of Constantinople's fall. The age of empires was ending. The age of the world was about to begin, and history was only pausing for breath before its next revolution. Echoes of Empire: How the Fall of Constantinople Changed the World. When the walls of Constantinople fell, the sound didn't stop at the Bosporus. It rolled across mountains, seas, and centuries. In distant kingdoms where people had never seen its marble towers, the echo arrived like thunder. And for many, it was not just the fall of a city, it was the fall of certainty. In Rome, the Pope wept in disbelief. Letters poured in from the east describing the slaughter. The great dome of Hagia Sophia turned to a mosque, and the cross of Christ replaced by the crescent moon. In Venice, merchants mourned not just faith, but fortune. The great trade routes that had once flowed through Byzantine harbors were now in the hands of the Ottomans. The Silk Road, that artery of ancient wealth, now ended at Mehmed's Gate. Europe was suddenly trapped, surrounded by sea and empire, its path to the riches of the East sealed by the cannons of the young Sultan. And yet, history has a strange way of turning endings into beginnings. Because as the Ottomans expanded, a handful of desperate merchants, explorers, and dreamers began to ask a question that would change the world. If we can no longer reach the East by land, what if we sail around it? From the fall of a city was born the age of exploration. In Portugal, Prince Henry the Navigator sent his ships farther down the African coast, hungry to find a sea route to India. In Genoa, a young sailor named Cristoforo Colombo listened to the stories of Constantinople's fall and whispered of sailing west instead of east. He believed he could reach Asia by crossing the open ocean. Few took him seriously until the world he sought appeared before him. The irony was cruel and perfect. The fall of the last Roman city had opened the door to a new world across the sea. While Constantinople's walls crumbled, Europe's horizons expanded. But that was not the only echo. The scholars who escaped the burning libraries of Byzantium carried something far greater than relics. They carried knowledge. They fled westward, across the Adriatic, bringing with them the writings of Plato, Aristotle, Ptolemy, and Euclid, works long forgotten in medieval Europe. In Florence, Venice, and Rome, artists and thinkers opened those ancient texts and found a new way to see the world. Within decades, the Renaissance had begun. Painters like Leonardo da Vinci, sculptors like Michelangelo, and thinkers like Copernicus all drank from the well of Greek wisdom reborn. The very city that had died in flames became, in absence, the seed of a new human awakening. Even the weapon that had ended Constantinople, the great cannon, left its mark. Warfare itself transformed. The age of stone walls and chivalric knights was gone forever. Armies that once relied on fortresses now learned to move, to strike, to wield the power of gunpowder and steel. The medieval world had died with the Theodosian Walls. The modern world was born from their ruins, and in the East, Mehmed's empire rose like a sun. Istanbul became not only the capital of the Ottoman world, but the bridge of civilizations. Traders from Cairo, Damascus, and Delhi met merchants from Venice and Ragusa beneath its domes. Its bazaars hummed with languages that spanned continents. From its harbors sailed ships bearing silk, spices, books, and ideas, each a piece of the new global age. But the echoes did not end there. Deep in Europe's heart, whispers began to spread, whispers of fear, of vengeance, of holy war reborn. The memory of Constantinople's fall became a wound that centuries could not heal. Kings and priests invoked it to rally armies, to build fleets, to justify conquest in the name of Christ or commerce. It became not just a memory, but a myth, a moment to be avenged, imitated, or surpassed. And yet, the strangest echo of all was cultural. In time, Europe would come to admire what it once feared. The Ottoman capital, once the tomb of Christendom, became a place of fascination. Its palaces, the envy of travelers; its libraries, the envy of scholars; its sciences, the envy of kings. Ambassadors wrote home describing its order, its power, and the strange beauty of a city, where church bells and the call to prayer mingled in the air. Even the name Constantinople refused to die. To the Greeks, it remained the city. To the West, it was still the dream of empire. To Mehmed, it was destiny fulfilled. And yet, for centuries afterward, people across the world would whisper that the Roman spirit had not truly perished, that it merely changed its crown and crossed its own shadow into a new age. The cannons had shattered stone, But they had also shattered boundaries, the boundary between East and West, between ancient and modern, between old faith and new reason. When we look at a map today, when we trace the routes that connect continents, when we walk beneath domes that blend Greek geometry with Islamic art, we are still walking in the echo of that morning in 1453. The fall of Constantinople did not just end the Middle Ages, it gave birth to the world we live in. And yet, there remains one final question, one that even Mehmed himself could never answer. If the fall of a city could change the world, what happens when the world itself begins to fall? Because every empire believes its walls will stand forever until the day the first crack appears, and history, always watching, begins to whisper once more.